And that's not just about how you reward people. Of course, in my financial services background, it basically came down to money. But it's not just about money. It's how you recognise good behaviours. A simple pat on the back can be really significant. As an audit and risk committee chair, if I see kind of good behaviours, I will always recognise that, and I will always reward that. And it's amazing what a simple thank you can do in many respects. So it's not always about, as I said, financial kind of gain. And then, of course, lastly, I'm just going to, because I've suddenly realised, lastly, it's about promoting honesty and transparency as well. So getting people to be open and honest and to share, again, good communication across the organisation is key, building those kind of networks. As part of that, something that's really important is what's been called risk talk. Now, it's not me that came up with this. This was another academic called Annette Mikes. She's done some really great research on this topic, and she's involved in that website, academic research. But they talk about the importance of risk talk, basically having open and honest conversations about risk. You know, one organisation I worked for, it was a university, in fact, so a charity, the top management there decided that everybody was too negative. Everybody was too negative all the time, so they issued an edict to kind of top management. It was that they didn't want any bad news. They only wanted good news. So I kind of put my head in my hands when you get those kind of situations. So, of course, they didn't hear about any of the things they needed to hear about, because they basically blocked people's ability to communicate things that weren't going quite so well. So having a kind of open, honest, unbiased conversations about risk is really key, and encouraging that throughout the organisation is really key. So everybody is encouraged to contribute. Everybody's opinion it matters. You may, of course, add different weights to different opinions, but you want to encourage people to talk openly about risk. That's, I think, a really key factor. I've already talked for too long. So let's kind of just point you in some directions. Steph, I think I've given you these slides already, but these slides, of course, can be distributed to everybody on the call, and of course it's being recorded, as you know, so you can go back and access these links. Here's some information from the IRM. There's some work that's been done, thought leadership that the IRM's done on risk culture. So some good resources there, including a guidance paper on risk culture that I wrote. There's also, as Steph mentioned, a training course. Actually, the next training course on risk culture is tomorrow, which might be a bit soon for some of you, but the IRM does run regular training courses on risk culture, and I think after tomorrow, the next one's in October. And Lewis, who manages this area, has said that if you've been on this webinar, if you say to them, the IRM training team, Lewis and Evis, that you've been on this webinar, you will get a 10% discount on that course. So 10% discount in addition to obviously IRM discounts, etc. if you want to do that course. If you're really keen, it's tomorrow. If not, then there's another one in October. But and then also there's some work from the ACCA. The ACCA recently did some very good research. Patricia Jackson or Johnson, I can't, anyway, Rachel Johnson, no relationship to you know who. She kind of heads up the IRM's the ACCA's thought leadership area, and they've done some really good work recently on risk culture too that you may find useful. It's not financial services specific, so it's relevant for all organisations elsewhere. And equally, if you want to talk to me, I don't work full time for Blerick Business School anymore, but they are probably the most famous business school you've never heard of. They're based in, of course, Belgium, and we do executive education, etc. But feel free to get in touch via my kind of work email there if you want to continue the conversation on risk culture. So I'll stop sharing now, Steph, and we'll see if we've got some questions. I think we have, because I can already see some some Q&As and some chats.
Yeah, we've got some coming in already, but a big thank you, Simon. Some really interesting insight and concepts there, and some really memorable kind of concepts of how to kind of embed and key pointers. So we've got some questions already coming in from David and Nigel. Just before we move to those, I just wanted to kind of share a thought, if people haven't seen it already, in the chat from Sarah. Love this one. Bad news early is good news. Provides the intervention opportunity to preclude risk manifestation before coming catastrophic. Really interesting thought there. But let's move to the questions, and please keep those coming in for Simon. So David, another one of our risk gurus with us today, and if you want to speak yourself, please feel free to switch your mic on. But David's asking, are the 6 elements in the ABC for success framework intended to be measures of risk culture? If so, how are each of these quantified?
So that, I mean, David, that's a great question, and it's the kind of the $6 million question. I mean, can they be quantified? I mean, yes, they can be, and you could use, I suppose, a range of measures. One I really like, although I suppose I would link it to accountability. I might also link it to behaviours, I suppose, but probably I'd link it to accountability. But one I like is late audit actions. So, you know, internal audit have done good audits, they've come up with management actions, and the management then don't do the actions. And I've sometimes known one organisation when I worked in management spent more time arguing about audit actions than they actually did doing the actions. So, you know, things like that, I think, can be a potential measure. On another one around kind of beliefs and kind of values, you get things like the Barrett Values Centre that people might have come across. That's an organisation that does kind of customised questionnaires. So they look at your values in the organisation, and they basically look to see whether people live those values. You know, are people's behaviours within the organisation kind of consistent with the values of the organisation? So there are ways in which you can potentially measure them. I think you have to be very careful, of course, when it comes to measuring in terms of risk culture. It's right and appropriate that you do, especially because a lot of management, of course, are culturally predisposed towards, of course, looking at things they can measure. You know, there's the famous but also completely false statement, you can't manage what you can't measure. But, you know, that still has, I think, a lot of strength in many organisations. So when you can find appropriate measures, that can be a good way to get a kind of spotlight on it. The way, again, I talked briefly about risk talk. What I see metrics here as great conversation starters, not the end point. So it's not really about the metric per se, it's about the conversations you're having about, say, late audit items, or whether people are really living the values in your organisation, or whether kind of, you know, training is completely up to date, or whatever it might be. So I think that's a good side of it. But also, you know, do make sure that you make it clear to top management that risk culture is not something that can be easily measured. It's as much about your own skills as a kind of, if you like, almost as an anthropologist. I say often when I talk about assessing risk culture, to some extent, that's what you're being. You're being an anthropologist, a corporate anthropologist. You're looking at behaviours and social networks, you know, within the organisation, how people interrelate to each other. So it's more about your kind of feelings about that kind of social interaction that matters as well. So you know, trust your gut as well as what can be reported. David, did I answer your question? Is there anything else on that front people want to talk about? Thank you, David.
And we've got a question from Nigel as well. Another one that's just come through from Gillian. If that suffices David's point. Nigel has a question. What are your thoughts on helping charity boards specifically to take risks? Charity boards are often very risk averse. Is it within your criteria of fit?
I completely agree. I've come across the same from a kind of charity perspective. I think to some extent, one of the problems is that where you have, of course, the word trustee, it maybe promotes a more kind of risk averse kind of mindset. Especially if you are a trustee and you're to some extent legally responsible for the organisation, but you don't really to reap any, if you like, financial rewards from your involvement in the organisation. That can be a real challenge. It can lead to that kind of more kind of risk averse mindset. I think partly here it's about kind of training and education, and I think boards value this as well, and that can be having a workshop, having them involved in a workshop, talking about risk appetite, for example, or about risk culture, getting them thinking perhaps more strategically about it, getting them understanding that risk is not necessarily a bad thing. I think also it's about helping them to understand that if you like, there are risks and there are opportunities, and sometimes to take an opportunity you have to take an element of risk, and that actually there can sometimes be more risk from not doing something than there is from doing it. So to give you an example, not quite charity, but I think it's a very relevant example in this context. As Steph mentioned, I'm a director of Cornwall Newquay Airport. You might know, of course, that we are a spaceport. We are the only, as it stands at the moment, spaceport in Great Britain, although there's some nasty Scottish airports that are looking like they want to get in on the act. But anyway, at the moment, we're the only one. Getting that spaceport license was very difficult. And we had the Virgin aircraft that took off, and we had to extend our kind of perimeter. We had to massively increase our insurance because there was a potential, of course, that this plane on takeoff might crash. And it might not just have gone into the sea, it could have crashed into Newquay, which would have been, of course, a rather bad thing. So, from a risk perspective, I was sitting there and we were in a board meeting, and of course, people were fixated on the downside. People were just fixated on the fact that this aircraft could crash, and it could be a massive, financial liability for us. And I actually, it was actually me that said, I think we're losing sight of the opportunity here. This is a very safety critical thing. It's being very well managed. We can document that everything is incredibly well managed. So if something goes wrong, we can very clearly show that there is no negligence on our part. Everything's been done properly. But we must also remember the big positive, because this is a huge benefit. This launch is a huge benefit for the Cornish economy. That one launch was worth many millions to the Cornish economy. And of course, if it was successful, sadly it wasn't, but it could have brought in a lot more money. So I think it's also about mindset, I think, is really key there as well. But I do understand your issue.
Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in now.
Yeah.
Gillian, the tune in the middle I'm hearing in my organisation tends to be risk management is a hindrance. This leads to a reluctance to do the risk talk. Any tips for combating the resistance, which seems cultural?
Yeah, and in fact, funny enough, I used to work for Lloyds Bank, and they've said the same thing recently. They've kind of been cutting their risk function because they're saying it's a hindrance. I think sometimes in risk functions we can be our own worst enemy. We've become very kind of procedural, very control focused, and very kind of no focused. Somebody said to me once, "There's always a but with you." Oh, that's great, but have you thought about this or have you thought about that? And that really made me think. So I think partly it's about how you deal with people, accentuating the positive, so encouraging positive behaviours, and maybe sometimes keeping quiet about less positive behaviours on a obviously risk adjusted basis, but kind of working against that kind of myth that risk managers are always about saying kind of no. I think another thing you can do on a practical basis is to produce a benefits log. So what are the benefits of risk management for the organisation? And it's not just about avoiding things. It could be about allowing you to do more of something, to do more work in very dangerous environments, for example, or to expand your operations or something of that nature. So a kind of benefits log, I think, could be quite a good thing. Also, something I've done in control assessments is not just have the question, where can control be increased, or where does control need to be increased? Also have the question, where can control be reduced? Because if you've gone through a thorough risk assessment, you perhaps identified some controls that are superficial, you can start to remove those controls, for example, on risk grounds. So people start to see the risk function not just as a barrier, but potentially as an enabler. And finally, it's also about, of course, building relationships, actually going and talking to people, sitting in a room, sometimes one-to-one, and going, look, if you like, what is your problem, or how can I help you? And have those kind of open and frank discussions, because often you can find ways in which you can start to support them. And I must say, I think sometimes the 3 lines of defence approach is a problem here, but the IIA, Institute of Internal Auditors, recently brought out the new 3 lines model. Notice they removed the term defence, and that encourages greater cooperation between the first and the second lines of the organisation. So really highlighting the importance of those kind of personal relationships. So the IIA work on the 3 lines model, I think, is also part of trying to address that issue.
Thank you, Simon. And I think for me as well, when I've been working out in the field, just to kind of reinforce a few points there, it's been more around moving to that concept that risk management is a tool, it's an enabler to help you achieve your strategic objectives. It's not just kind of managing risk, whilst it is that as well, and it is mitigating risk. It's a tool and enabler to help you move forward and grow, but do it in a safe fashion, and to really kind of link your risks through to your strategic objectives, and to be able to take risk-based decisions and move forward. So I think seeing that kind of flip side of it and taking it to that next level, which often we've not quite made it there yet. I think when we get there, that's when you start to see the real value coming through. But back to our questions, another one from David, just coming back on those kind of original thoughts. David was saying, you talked about the need to align risk culture with vision and values and with strategy. How would you know if you've got alignment?
I mean, there's various approaches here. A simple approach that you're probably already doing is some kind of employee kind of engagement survey that you might do. So you can obviously have questions linked to the kind of vision and the values, and you can see what people's kind of responses are. So survey is one approach. You can, as I mentioned, the Barrett Values Centre that exists. That's BARRET, I think it is. They kind of do kind of customized questionnaires where they look at your values, and they basically see what the alignment is between your risk culture and those values, and they give you kind of like an alignment score. You can also do sort of like interviews and focus groups where you actually talk to people, about those values and what they actually mean to them as employees of the organisation. Workshops. I said we just had a workshop in Corserve where we were talking about this. We were talking about our current values. We were talking about whether people really live those values in the organisation. So that obviously involved kind of line managers to get their kind of input. It's those kinds of things I think that you can just start to think about it. But again, it's mostly about having those conversations. Are people really living those values, and what do we need to do perhaps potentially to change things? Even things like sometimes whistleblowing or encouraging people to kind of speak up about these things too, about what they feel, about the values of the organisation, and whether people are really living those values. That can be really useful as well, having those kind of honest conversations, I think.
Just before we move to our next question for our anonymous participant, I think Chan mentioned earlier in the chat just relating a little bit more about some of the organisations being more family businesses, and how that had probably a more difficult challenge on the table in terms of influencing risk culture. Was there any kind of pointers there, Simon, where we're perhaps seeing more family businesses and what we could do there in terms of influencing risk culture?
I've certainly heard, and I from various colleagues over the
This meeting is being recorded.
Because they kind of respect. Aware of the fact that sometimes you have dominant, if you like, a chief executive or a very dominant person at the top of the organisation, and that can sometimes be hugely problematic. And where that is the case, you need to find some way of kind of offsetting that power. But sometimes it is about just going, you know what, I can't deal with this. I'm just going to have to leave and find another better organisation.
Thank you, Simon. So just going back to questions now, I've got our anonymous participant. I feel a little overwhelmed when I try to assess risk culture, as do we all. My organisation has devolved strategy into different services, and it sometimes feels like I'm working with 200 very different organisations. So there is a generic risk framework, but the response to that framework differs from team to team. Any suggestions on how to capture and report on where we are to the trustees?
That's certainly a challenging one. I suppose are there some kind of common ground? There's some kind of common kind of indicators that could be used very high level. And obviously, when you're reporting to trustees, ideally you want to keep it relatively kind of high level. And are those differences justified, or are those differences perhaps a symptom of something culturally challenging in terms of this organisation? So is there a need possibly to kind of address some of those differences? Again, I think a lot of the time it's about networking, it's about building relationships with those people, asking them, why is what you're doing different to what somebody else is doing? Possibly even peer review. That also can be sometimes a solution here. So you don't go in and review what somebody's doing, but you get another manager in another area to review it. And maybe when they start talking to each other, they realise that they're not so different after all, because they're potentially more likely to listen to each other. But that does sound like a challenging environment.
Yeah, definitely. Well, great question. Great one to share with the group. So another question from Rachel. Interesting aspect of really living the values. Any more advice, Simon, on how you deal with those who say one thing on paper but not follow through supporting behaviour?
I think you've really got to address that. So obviously, if you have the authority to address it, because it's very much about it. It's essential that the people at the top of the organisation live those values. If you haven't got the authority, then I think it's ideally finding an ally. So have you got somebody on the board who's going to be a good ally in terms of this, that could help you to address those issues? Yeah, I've seen the same thing. There was an organisation I worked for that had said a lot about its environmental credentials, and yet all of the directors of the organisation drove gas guzzling cars and got free petrol and all the rest of it from the organisation. It was if you were sufficiently senior, you were even allowed to have your own waste paper bin, so you didn't have to recycle. And again, it's crazy stuff. People not living the values. Others in the organisation clearly noticed that very quickly. So you do have to find ways to kind of stamp that out, because it's just not appropriate. It's just not acceptable. But you're going to need somebody with sufficient authority to address that.
Thank you, Simon. So I think that's all the questions, but we've got lots of interesting points being raised in the chat as well. If anyone's not seen the chat yet, just reinforcing messages. Charles, really like the risk talk message. Completely agree. Too often the risk management process actively gets in the way of conversation. The right people talking and the right risks at the right time is key. Less process, more forward to talk. Completely agree there. I think for me it's about that power of collaboration, having those enriched conversations. But yeah, risk talk. What else have we got? Kind of
risk talk, kind of things you could do at the top level of the organisation. So for say board meetings, trustee meetings, it's good to have risk talked about early, because sometimes you have kind of like the risk management section towards the end of the agenda, and everyone's kind of thinking, oh, it's lunchtime, or I want to go home, or whatever it is. So it tends to be quite rushed through. So if you move it earlier in the agenda, then people are fresher. You potentially have better kind of debate about the issues. You also set the scene for further discussions down the line. So you start talking about risk, and then after that, you kind of talk about strategy, for example, and then people remember what they talked about in risk, and they use that to influence. In team meetings generally, it's good to have occasional conversations about risk. Say to people, where do you think the risks are at the moment? What are the kind of key risks that we need to think about? How can we address those? How can we work together to kind of address those? You identified this as an issue. Have others encountered this as a potential issue? Has anybody got any solutions around it? So kind of having those kind of open discussions as well. And I think if people realise that they are being listened to and their opinion matters, that can really help.
Another really good one coming through here seems to be very popular. Is around the comparison of risk management to a game of snakes and ladders in Charles's organisation there. So whilst trying to land on the ladders, avoiding the snakes. So I guess it's a really good concept that brings it to life a little bit more, perhaps gets people a little bit more excited about it. So too often risk management, the organisation is a game of snakes, and no one mentions the ladders. But yeah, I guess it's bringing through that flip side as well, isn't it?
Accentuating the positives, helping people understand, for example, that good risk management should allow you to do more. The brakes on a car, as it were, they slow you down, but they also allow you to go, faster. So, good risk management should enable organisations, charities to reach. I mean, in social housing, it's as any of you involved in social housing, construction risks are substantial, especially at the moment with kind of rising costs. It's hard to find labour, etc., house prices. If you just focus on the downside risks, you wouldn't do anything. But if you say, look, we're an organisation that can manage those risks effectively, and if we can manage those risks effectively, that means we can basically build more houses than we would do, creating more affordable homes for people that need them. That's a huge positive. So I think it's always understanding the positive. What's the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? So risk management is not just not the prevention side. It's about facilitation. Allowing the organisation basically to do more with less.
Absolutely. And Lynette's made a good point here as well. It's a good way of justifying expenditure on projects and plans. So I guess you're seeing those risk-based decisions coming through there as well, getting that buy-in.
Completely. Good project management is key. If you have good project managers, it's not just about the process. It's about, again, allowing the organisations to do things efficiently and effectively, and that could be really key.
Absolutely. So any further questions for Simon while we've still got him? We've got lots of good points kind of going on there. We've had so much insight. Can't thank you enough, Simon, for sharing all your expertise, and everybody else in the room as well. Thank you very much for all your engagement and all those points. Any final questions at all? We've still got a few minutes.
Has anybody tried to do anything around, for example, assessing their risk culture, and how did it go? Has anybody tried using any of the kind of consultancy firms out there to do it? What were your experiences? That's I'd be interested to learn as well if anybody's done anything around this.
Anyone wants to hop in? We've had lots of thoughts.
Or how do your kind of top management, how do the board, how do they react to these kind of discussions? Is it seen as tree hugging, kind of hippie stuff, or is it seen as something really important?
Hi. I think in our organisation, I think there'd be more appetite to talk about risk culture and assess culture as a whole. But I think for us in risk management to kind of hop on the back of that or infiltrate that, so it's not risk culture to one side and then the rest of culture, so it's integrated. I think there'd definitely be more up for that. So that, I think that's what I'm looking for, is those opportunities to pull out the risk threads in the culture work.
I think that's a really good point, Gillian. I mean, a lot of organisations will talk about culture, will have culture workshops, or the board will talk about culture. Certainly for me, I mean, I think there's a danger that you over compartmentalize culture anyway. I mean, we can talk about risk culture, compliance culture, conduct culture, accountability culture, speak up culture, you name it. At the end of the day, they are all really just elements of the organisation's broader culture. So I think if your organisation is talking about culture, definitely, as you said there, Gillian, jump on that bandwagon, because things will come out of that are very, very relevant from a risk management perspective. They're not divorced. These things are not separate. They're all part of the whole that is your organisation's culture.
We've taken our organisational values and then said what that means in terms of risk behaviours, attitudes, etc., that we'd want to see, which I think people have found that very helpful.
I think that's a really good approach. That's a good thing, I think, to incorporate into risk management policies, but also into training, to help people understand that your risk management activities are directly aligned to your vision, your values, also the strategy. I think another good discussion you can have with people is, how can risk management support our strategy? How can it help us to achieve our strategic objectives, as well as how is it aligned to that vision and values? I think that's really good. And again, if people start joining the dots then and realizing that risk management is not a separate activity over here, it's an integrated part of running an effective charity or indeed any business.
Got another question that's coming from David. What size of charity do you think a culture survey would be beneficial to?
I mean, I think for really small ones, the easiest thing to do is just talk to people. It's just quicker and easier, and of course it's smaller. I don't know. What I mean, how many people can you really keep up to kind of speak with personally? I don't know, maybe 100. Beyond that, 200, 300, 500, definitely I think you're in survey territory, because you can't know everything, within the organisation.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks for all these.
David's got his hand up.
Questions? Okay. Do you want to comment there, David?
Hand up there.
Yes, thank you, if you don't mind. Just, Simon, you talked about whether people have implemented any of this before. And I think it is important to remember, we're talking about the charities environment here, so it's generally smaller organisations, and it might be something that the SIG wanted to think about providing another one of those nice small leaflets that gives us some guidance on how we can actually assess culture and develop culture. That might be something that you want to think about. But you provided a link back to the 2012 work that we did, this IRM guidance. And one of them which is freely downloadable from the IRM website, is this little thing, which is the executive summary. And in here, there are 10 questions the board should ask. And so there's 10 questions, which I think are absolutely spot on. And they test these sort of 8 issues in the IRM. So it's my phone ringing. They test the 8 sort of parameters of the IRM risk aspects, risk culture aspects model. So I think, we've got some good stuff we can build on here in the smaller environment. And obviously in my own consulting, you can dig as deep as you want to go under each of those 8 parameters and 10 diagnostic questions. But I think if people are looking for somewhere to start, this little booklet, which we can download free today from the IRM website, is a good place to start, and we may as well use what we've already got. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for sharing.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. But thank you very much. A huge thank you to Simon for taking the time out to join us today, and thank you very much for everybody's engagements, your questions, your thoughts. Obviously, the recording is going to be available, will be uploaded into the SIG specialist area on the intranet after, and Simon will take those slides as well. I think Kate wanted to, are you giving us a wave there? Who's that? Just a wave? Well done. But just before we kind of close the session, I just wanted to just take you back to our next in-person event. The marketing is just about to come out for that. I mentioned earlier, it's going to be on the 11th of July. So that is an in-person networking event, similar to previous events that we've done. So John and Catherine have put a lot of hard work into that, and we've had lots of requests to do a focus session on volunteering. So we're going to be looking at adapting to change, the charity volunteering landscape, and we've got an excellent lineup of speakers, including guests from Crow, Samaritans, the Hardman Trust and British Heart Foundation as well, which is where it will be held in London. Catherine and John, I don't know whether you want to say anything more about that event, but it will be coming out to everybody soon. If you can join us, we'd love to see everybody there. Did you want to say anything else, Catherine or John?
No, you've covered it. Yeah, it's on the 11th of July in the afternoon, and it's just going to be a really good opportunity to network and speak to other risk professionals around the changing landscape of volunteering.
Yeah, it's 1 o'clock, isn't it? 1 o'clock till 4:30. I think we've got
12 o'clock, I think.
12 o'clock. Okay.
12 till 4:30. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, we're gonna have lunch first. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, 12 o'clock before for lunch. So it'd be great to see everyone. It's always great when you come and join us in person. Again, you get that time to have a chat over lunch as well, and really bring those areas of challenge or also ideas and success stories as well that are working in to continue to build those relationships. But thank you very much again today. Thanks again to Simon. Thanks for everybody else, and to David for sharing his expertise. It's been great. You might have seen the survey pop up. It's always really useful to hear from you in the feedback survey to see how we can make these sessions better. But thanks again, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing everyone at our in-person event, and we've got some further coffee catch-ups coming up later on in the year as well. So thanks again for joining us today. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.